saving and the social cost of taxation. That is present with me by Aronson, Shalani, and Laura. This paper talks about an indicator that has come to play a key role in the context of the sustainable development, and I chose it because I was interested to know what there were behind the sustainable indicator. This indicator was coined by Hamilton, and the World Bank regularly published numbers for this indicator on a national basis. They are typically calculated as if the tax system is non-distortionary. So these calculations assume the resource allocation is first best. For this reason, haven't received sufficient attention. The main purpose of this paper is to present an analog to genuine saving in a second-best economy, where the government raises revenue to finance public expenditure or environmental policy through distortionary taxes, which are associated with an excess burden that may affect the welfare change experienced by the economy during a short time interval. So they want to show that the social cost of public debt, which depends on the marginal excess burden, ought to be reflected in the genuine saving. They're going to show this by using a model that was developed by Chamely, that is an extension of the Ramsey type model used in earlier literature as on welfare accounting. And with the modification that they add a public sector that raise revenue through distortionary taxes instead of lump sum taxes. They're going to present some dates from some countries like Greece, Portugal, and USA. And to show that neglecting the social cost of taxation may give rise to biased estimates of genuine saving, and so could give incorrect information as to whether the economy is locally sustainable. So I'm going to start to explain what genuine saving is. As I said before, it's an indicator of sustainable development, and it's called like this because it is an indicator of comprehensive net investment in all capital stocks. This means that it doesn't take it doesn't consider only the value of change in physical capital, but it also considers the social value of change in human and natural capital stocks. So it could be considered an exact measure of welfare change over a short-time interval, and it also can to play an interesting role as an indicator of local sustainable development. And the conventional way to measure this indicator is by adding the net investment in physical capital, the net investment in the environmental public good. But they're going to show through this model that I'm going to present now that this procedure gives a correct measure of welfare change if the resource allocation is just for best, and so it doesn't work anymore when the resource allocation is second best. So this is the model, the Chamely model. I'm going to show quickly some instruments that they use to achieve the results. First of all, we have a social welfare function that is equal to a simultaneous indirect utility function. Here the social welfare function coincides with objective faced by the consumer, and this indirect utility function is defined conditional to the marginal utility of wealth. So they consider utility function that describe the individual preferences that depends on the consumption of a private good, of the quantity of public good, and also depends on the leisure time of each person. Then they use also an Hamiltonian function that describes the decision problem facing by the government, that will be to choose the net wage rate and the contribution to the public good at each instant to maximize the social welfare. And also here this function is defined conditional on the marginal utility of wealth, the accumulation of public good, the equation for motion for government bonds, and it takes into account also the resource constraints that the government faces. By taking the first order of this function, so the Hamiltonian function, we can obtain a measure of welfare change that, and then they define also the optimal value function that at time t, and by their, I'm sorry, I don't know why I didn't respond. By totally differentiating this function with respect to the time, I made a mistake. By totally differentiating this function with respect to the time, we obtain the measure of welfare change over a short time interval. To explore the relationship between the right-hand side of this equation and the measure of genuine saving that I suggest above, that is given by the sum of the net investment in human capital and the network capital to the physical capital, they begin to evaluating the welfare change measure in the first best resource allocation. So we can see from this formula that the social welfare function is equal to the Hamiltonian function when the marginal excess burden is equal to 0. This happens when there's the first best allocation. So in this case, the genuine saving is given by the sum of the value of net investment in physical and environmental capital, and it's also consistent with the approach taken by the World Bank. But as I said before, this balance doesn't work anymore in the second best economy. I check. I don't know why I made these mistakes. As we can see here, the social value function is always equal to the measure of the genuine saving, but there are two more elements here that are represented by the bonds of the government, and the fact that here the marginal excess burden is not more equal to 0. So they want to show that the variable, the marginal excess burden, when it is negative, affects the measure of genuine saving, because the government debt can affect this measure, and so increasing government debt at present necessitates distortionary taxes, higher distortionary taxes in the future. So as I said before, when the marginal excess burden is negative, the public debt accumulation gives rise to a social cost due to the distortions generated by the tax system. And so they want to underline the role played by the distortionary taxes that may affect the social welfare, and so the measure of this indicator. The main result is that public debt or asset accumulation affects the genuine saving in the second best, which does not in the first best, where the marginal excess burden is equal to 0. And they simplify by adjusting the current numbers for genuine saving, and they augment the numbers for genuine saving published by the World Bank by the value of change in government debt, defined as the public deficit times the marginal excess burden measured in consumption units. Here we have some examples. When between the difference calculation of the genuine saving, so they compare the measure of genuine saving published by the World Bank with the own measure of welfare of genuine saving. With the continuous line, that is here, they want to represent the measure of welfare of genuine saving published by the World Bank. Instead, the dotted line represents the measure of welfare of genuine saving with different level of marginal excess burden. The first one represents marginal excess burden equal to 0.1. The second one represents a measure of genuine saving equal to 0.3, and the last one is equal to a measure of genuine saving equal to 0.5. And for example, if we consider the USA case, we can see that in 2008 here, the measure of welfare of genuine saving taken by the World Bank is positive. Instead, their calculation consider that the genuine saving is negative, because there is a high level of marginal excess burden. So they show that the revenue raised by the public sector to this through this paper in a real world economy typically necessitates higher distortionary taxes that are associated with an excess burden that affect the welfare change that the economy experiences during a short time interval. For this reason, the measure for genuine saving ought to be modified accordingly. So they conclude explaining that neglecting the accumulation of public debt may lead to the wrong conclusion as to whether the economy is locally sustainable, and so the conventional genuine measure of genuine saving may be a poor indicator if as when the economy is at risk of becoming locally